The world as they knew it ended on a quiet Tuesday morning. It began with a simple news broadcast, an outbreak of an unknown disease, a virus spread rapidly by human contact. Within hours, panic spread faster than the virus itself. Cities were locked down, military forces were deployed, but the virus could not be contained. The infected became ravenous, mindless creatures, hunting the living with an insatiable hunger. For Sarah Reynolds, the fall of civilization was a slow burn. As an emergency room nurse, she was used to chaos, but nothing in her training prepared her for this. She had seen the first few cases, the fever, the bloodshot eyes, the aggressiveness. But it wasn't until the first infected patient ripped through the ER, biting her colleague in a frenzy, that Sarah realized the true horror of what was happening. Chaos erupted. The hospital became a war zone, with people trying to escape, while others fought for their lives. Sarah, covered in blood, ran. She grabbed her things, made her way out of the hospital, and then into the streets of what had once been a bustling city. Now, it was eerily quiet. The once thriving metropolis was a ghost town, the streets littered with abandoned vehicles, empty stores, and the occasional scream or gunshot echoing from somewhere far off. The sound of helicopters overhead only added to the sense of impending doom. In the days that followed, Sarah learned to adapt quickly. It wasn't just about staying alive anymore, it was about surviving in a world that had changed forever. The government's efforts to contain the outbreak were futile. Martial law was declared, but it was clear no army could fight the relentless tide of the undead. Food supplies dwindled, and the survivors fought among themselves for scraps. She encountered a small group of survivors in an old grocery store on the outskirts of the city. There was Mark, a former soldier with a hardened gaze and a sharp mind, Anna, a quiet woman with a rifle slung over her shoulder who had lost her family in the early days of the outbreak, and Jake, a young man who seemed too innocent for the world they now lived in. They were all in it for one reason: survival. They formed an uneasy alliance, bound by necessity more than trust. They scavenged for food, water, and anything else that might help them stay alive for another day. It wasn't long before they realized that the true danger wasn't just the zombies, it was the other survivors. Groups of people, desperate and scared, were far more dangerous than the undead. Some had turned to violence, robbing and killing anyone they encountered. Trust became a rare commodity. As Sarah's group made their way through the city, they saw firsthand the extent of the devastation. Buildings were burned to the ground, the once luxurious apartments now home to the undead. The streets were filled with broken glass, overturned cars, and the occasional distant scream. The air smelled of death, both human and the stench of the creatures that now roamed freely. It was during one of their scavenging trips that they encountered their first real battle with the undead. The group had ventured into a shopping mall, hoping to find supplies. But they weren't alone. The sound of their footsteps triggered a horde of zombies, and in seconds, the group found themselves surrounded. Mark immediately took charge, pulling out his weapons and ordering everyone to follow his lead. The group fought fiercely, using whatever they could to defend themselves: knives, pipes, even chairs. But as the number of zombies grew, so did their fear. It wasn't just about getting out anymore, it was about staying alive. In the midst of the chaos, Sarah found herself wondering if there was any hope left in this broken world. Would they survive the night? Would anyone ever be able to rebuild? The questions swirled in her mind, but there was no answer. There was only one thing they could do: fight, survive, and keep moving forward. The mall was a deadly trap. What had seemed like a simple mission for supplies quickly turned into a fight for their lives. Mark had proven to be a capable leader, barking orders and rallying the group when the situation grew desperate. Anna, her rifle steady in her hands, picked off zombies with precision, while Jake, who had surprised everyone with his agility and quick thinking, fought with an intensity that belied his youthful appearance. But Sarah had seen the toll the battle had taken on them all. They'd lost their sense of security, their sense of safety. The zombies were relentless, and their numbers were growing. The horde in the mall wasn't an isolated incident, it was the new normal. Once they'd made it out, bloodied and bruised, they fled the mall, only to find the streets even more treacherous than before. The world outside was unforgiving, and the realization hit Sarah hard: there was no refuge. The zombies weren't the only threat. Humanity had turned on itself. The desperation and fear in people's eyes were as deadly as any bite. As they traveled, the group encountered their first hostile survivors, a band of armed men holed up in a fortified apartment building. They were aggressive, demanding food, supplies, and weapons in exchange for their lives. Mark attempted to negotiate, but it was clear these men had no intention of helping anyone but themselves. The situation grew tense, and just as things were about to spiral into violence, Anna made a snap decision. She pulled her rifle up and fired a single shot, taking down one of the men before they had a chance to make their move. The rest of the men fled, but the tension remained. "That wasn't self-defense," Sarah said quietly, her eyes meeting Anna's. The two women exchanged a brief, calculating look. "It was survival," Anna replied, coldly. The rest of the group remained silent. They knew better than to argue. When survival was on the line, morals became a luxury they couldn't afford. They continued their journey through the devastated city, seeking out a safe haven, but every place they ventured seemed more dangerous than the last. Food and water were increasingly scarce, and they had to be resourceful. Sarah, using her knowledge of medicine, made the best of what little they had, treating minor wounds and infections, trying to keep the group alive one day at a time. Mark took on the role of protector, keeping a lookout for both zombies and other hostile survivors. One evening, as they set up camp in an abandoned building, Sarah found herself alone with Jake. The young man had become a quiet presence in the group, always following orders without question, but Sarah could see the toll the world was taking on him. The loss of his family had hardened him, and though he rarely spoke, Sarah saw the sadness in his eyes. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice soft. Jake shrugged, his gaze distant. "I don't know. It doesn't get easier, but you just keep moving, right?" Sarah nodded, understanding. She had stopped asking herself the same question a long time ago. There was no answer, just the next step, the next survival tactic. In a world overrun by the undead, the only certainty was that nothing was certain. That night, as the group huddled together for warmth, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. They were becoming too dependent on each other, too close. In a world where betrayal was a constant threat, it was only a matter of time before that trust would be tested. As the darkness closed in, the sound of distant moans echoed through the building. The zombies were close. But it wasn't the undead Sarah feared. It was the people they were starting to trust. The uneasy peace that had settled over the group after the encounter with the hostile survivors was short-lived. Despite Mark's best efforts to keep the group unified, the tension simmered beneath the surface. Trust was hard to come by in a world like this. The weight of their shared survival was beginning to feel less like a bond and more like a ticking time bomb, ready to explode at any moment. It wasn't long before Sarah's fears started to come true. Late one evening, as they were making camp in a once luxurious hotel, they found a note pinned to the door of their makeshift barricade: "You have something we need. Leave now or we'll take it from you." Mark immediately assumed it was the same group of armed men they had encountered before, but there was no sign of them. No movement, no sounds from the street. It was eerily silent, but the threat was clear. "We need to leave," Mark said, his voice low but firm. "They'll come for us eventually. We can't afford another fight." "But where will we go?" Anna asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "We've already been to every safe spot we could find. There's nowhere left." "I know," Mark muttered, rubbing his face in exhaustion. "But we can't stay here. We don't have a choice." The group was divided. Jake and Anna were both reluctant to leave, feeling that they might be better off facing whatever danger came rather than constantly running. But Sarah knew better. They couldn't afford to make mistakes. They had already made too many. They packed up what little they had, and in the dead of night, they began moving. They kept low, sticking to alleyways and abandoned buildings, trying to avoid the main roads where both zombies and hostile survivors were more likely to patrol. But the city was a labyrinth, and no matter how carefully they moved, they weren't invisible. The soft crunch of footsteps on broken glass echoed in the distance, making Sarah's heart race. Just when they thought they might escape unnoticed, they found themselves cornered in an old abandoned church. Their path had been blocked off by a sudden horde of zombies, drawn in by the sound of their movement. Panic surged through the group. There was no way out. Mark was the first to react, grabbing Sarah and pulling her toward the stairs leading to the upper levels of the church. "Move! Go, go, go," he shouted, his voice urgent and commanding. They scrambled, rushing up to the second floor, but the horde was closing in fast. They could hear the shuffling feet and the guttural groans of the undead, growing louder with each passing second. In the chaos, Sarah caught a glimpse of Anna looking back toward the ground floor, her rifle still clutched tightly in her hands. "Anna!" Sarah yelled, but it was too late. Anna had already broken off from the group, her eyes locked onto something far off in the shadows. "Stay close!" Mark barked, trying to pull Sarah further away from the stairs. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Anna wasn't acting like herself. She had always been the level-headed one, the one who kept her cool under pressure. But now, she was moving with a purpose, almost as if she had a plan of her own. Before Sarah could follow, there was a sudden explosion of gunfire from the first floor. It was deafening, followed by a muffled scream. "Anna!" Sarah cried out, but Mark held her back. He was the only one who understood the risk of going down there. They couldn't afford to lose anyone else, not now. It was too late. Anna's sacrifice gave them the window they needed. The gunfire drew the attention of the zombies, and in the chaos, the group was able to escape through a side door. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like another fracture in the already fragile bond between them. As they ran through the night, leaving the church and the chaos behind, Sarah could hardly hold back the tears. Anna had done what she thought was best, but at what cost? In a world overrun by the undead, survival came with impossible choices, and no one could be trusted to make them all without losing something in the process. But Sarah knew one thing for sure: this world was broken, and they were all just trying to survive in the rubble. The cold air stung Sarah's face as they continued their trek through the abandoned city, the streets now a silent graveyard of what was once a vibrant world. Their hearts were heavy, the loss of Anna hanging like a shadow over them. But there was no time for mourning. Survival was their only goal. They had to keep moving. It had been a few days since they lost Anna, and the group had become more wary, more broken. Mark's leadership had shifted. He wasn't the confident, determined leader he once was. He was increasingly erratic, as if the weight of every decision, every life he couldn't save, was beginning to crush him. Sarah could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the toll the constant struggle had taken on him. The pressure was breaking him, piece by piece. And Jake was starting to crack as well. He had become more withdrawn, barely speaking, his once youthful energy replaced by a cold, hardened demeanor. The loss of Anna had shattered something in him, too, and Sarah feared they were all losing more than just their humanity. They were losing their will to keep going. They had set up camp for the night in an old fire station. It offered some shelter, a safe vantage point, and the hope of finding something useful. But Sarah wasn't so sure anymore. Hope was becoming a foreign concept, like a word they had all forgotten the meaning of. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the distant sound of moaning reached their ears, a familiar and dread-filled sound. Zombies were drawing closer, but it wasn't just the undead Sarah had to worry about. Her mind kept returning to the note they had found weeks ago, the one that threatened to take what they had. They were still out there, somewhere. The same group that had caused them so much trouble before. The hostile survivors. It was only a matter of time before they found them. "We need to fortify this place," Mark said, his voice low and tense. He was trying, as he always did, to keep things calm, but Sarah could see the cracks in his resolve. "I'll check the back door," Jake volunteered, his voice flat. He sounded distant, as if he wasn't entirely present. Sarah wanted to stop him, to ask if he was okay, but she knew better. Jake was no longer the person she had met in the early days of the outbreak. He had changed, hardened by the unforgiving world they now lived in. Everyone had. The hours passed in uneasy silence as they worked to strengthen their defenses, barricading windows and doors, checking their weapons. They tried to remain focused, but the sounds of the undead growing nearer were a constant reminder that the night was far from safe. As the moon rose high, a sudden crash echoed through the fire station. The back door had been forced open. "Get ready!" Mark yelled, grabbing his rifle. His voice was shaky, but there was no mistaking the urgency in it. The group quickly fell into position. Sarah readied her knife, the weapon she had come to trust more than anything else. Anna's rifle, which had once belonged to the woman who had been her comrade, now felt foreign in Sarah's hands. She felt a pang of guilt, but there was no time for hesitation. Then, the door burst open. A group of heavily armed survivors stormed into the fire station, weapons raised, their faces hard and unforgiving. They were the same men who had threatened them days ago. They were no longer just a nuisance, they were a serious threat. "You thought you could hide, huh?" one of them sneered. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a scar running down his left cheek. His eyes were cold, dead, like the world around them. "We don't want trouble," Mark said, his voice strained but firm. He stood in front of the group, his rifle aimed at the intruders. "We're just trying to survive." "Too bad for you, we're the ones who decide who survives now," the man spat, his hand twitching toward his gun. Before Mark could respond, the man lunged forward, and the standoff turned violent in an instant. The group fought back, bullets flying, shouts echoing through the building. Sarah found herself in the thick of it, dodging gunfire, narrowly avoiding being hit as she moved quickly to take out one of the attackers. In the chaos, something in Jake snapped. He moved with a terrifying speed, almost animalistic in his aggression. Sarah watched, horror-stricken, as he grabbed one of the intruders by the throat, slamming him into the wall with a sickening thud. The man struggled, but Jake was unstoppable. His eyes were wild, as if the death surrounding them had awakened something inside him, something darker. "Jake!" Sarah shouted, rushing forward to pull him off. But it was too late. The man was already unconscious, his face pale and bloodied. Mark grabbed Jake by the shoulder, pulling him away. "That's enough," he barked, his voice hoarse. But Jake didn't respond. He was breathing heavily, his hands shaking as he slowly lowered his weapon. The intruders were gone. Some had fled in the chaos, others lay dead on the floor. But the fight had taken its toll. The group was once again left to pick up the pieces. As Sarah glanced around the room, she saw the truth: they had won the fight, but they were losing the war. In this world, survival meant more than just fighting zombies, it meant fighting the very things inside them that were slowly breaking them apart. And with every fight, every loss, Sarah realized that the real battle was not outside the walls, they had already lost too much. The fight now was within themselves. The fire station was eerily quiet after the chaos had subsided. The group sat in exhausted silence, each of them nursing their wounds, both physical and emotional. Sarah had never seen Jake so volatile, so consumed by the bloodshed. It was as if something inside him had shattered, and there was no going back. Mark sat at the far end of the room, cleaning his rifle with mechanical precision, his mind clearly elsewhere. Anna's absence had left an irreplaceable void in the group, and Mark was struggling to fill it. But it wasn't just Anna's death that had changed him, it was the weight of every decision, every confrontation. He had been their leader, their protector, but now he was falling apart, one crack at a time. Sarah stood and approached the window, gazing out at the streets below. The world had become unrecognizable, a graveyard of the old world, overrun with the undead and the remnants of a broken humanity. The horizon was streaked with the orange and red hues of the setting sun, casting a haunting glow over the ruins. There was no escape. No matter where they went, they were trapped in this world of constant terror. "We can't keep doing this," Sarah muttered to herself, more to the world outside than anyone else. She had been trying to hold it all together, trying to keep her group alive, but the cost of survival was becoming unbearable. The losses were mounting, the bloodshed unending. The toll it was taking on them was far worse than the physical wounds they had endured. "Sarah?" Mark's voice cut through her thoughts. She turned to face him, his face weary and drawn. "We need to talk." Sarah nodded, stepping away from the window. She could sense the heaviness in his voice, the need for answers that neither of them had. "We can't keep running forever," he said, his voice low and strained. "We're running out of options, Sarah. We're running out of time." "I know," she replied, her heart heavy with the truth of his words. "But what are we supposed to do? Every time we think we've found a safe place, it falls apart. Every time we meet someone, they either try to kill us or they end up dead." Mark's jaw tightened. "We're not going to make it if we keep going like this." Sarah glanced over at Jake, who was sitting against the wall, his eyes blank and distant. He hadn't said a word since the fight earlier, and she wasn't sure what was going on inside his head. He had always been quiet, but now it felt like he was lost to them, consumed by the violence he'd witnessed, and been part of. "We need a plan," Sarah said, her voice firm. "We can't just keep drifting. We need to find a way to fix this." Mark nodded, but Sarah could see the doubt in his eyes. "And what do you suggest? Do you think we can just rebuild society? That we'll find a safe haven where we can start over?" "I don't know," she admitted, her voice shaking slightly. "But I know we can't keep living like this. We can't keep running, waiting for the next fight to break out." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Neither of them knew what the answer was, but they both knew that whatever came next would be their last chance to make it. They had to either give up or fight for something worth living for. "We need to go south," Sarah said after a long pause. "I've heard rumors, whispers of a place, a safe zone. Somewhere the military is trying to hold." Mark looked at her, his face filled with a mix of hope and skepticism. "A safe zone? Do you really think it's real?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. She wasn't sure. But she had to believe there was something out there, somewhere that wasn't just more bloodshed and despair. If they kept moving, kept fighting, they might find it. Maybe they could survive this, after all. "We have to try," she said finally. "We don't have anything left, but we have to try." Mark stood up slowly, his face a mask of indecision. For a long moment, he didn't speak, his eyes searching Sarah's as if looking for some sign that this was the right choice. Finally, he gave a slow nod. "All right," he said. "We'll head south. But we're going to need more than just hope." "I know," Sarah replied softly. "We'll need everything we have left." As the group prepared to leave, packing what little they had, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this journey would be different. She had no idea what awaited them in the south, whether the rumors of a safe zone were real or just a false hope to keep people moving. But she had to believe that it was worth the risk. The world had taken so much from them, but Sarah wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. They gathered their things and headed out into the night, leaving the broken fire station behind them. The streets were empty, save for the occasional shuffling of the undead. The air was thick with the stench of decay, but Sarah breathed in the cold night air, letting it fill her lungs. They were still alive. That was all that mattered. But as they moved through the city, the sound of footsteps echoing in the distance made her stop in her tracks. It wasn't the zombies. It wasn't even other survivors. It was something else, something far worse. And in that moment, Sarah knew that their battle was far from over. The true test of survival was only just beginning. The sounds of shuffling footsteps echoed in the distance, drawing the group's attention. It wasn't the moaning of zombies, nor the footsteps of human survivors, they were too measured, too deliberate. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she signaled for the group to stop, crouching low against the ruined wall of a crumbling storefront. "Do you hear that?" she whispered urgently. Mark nodded, his hand resting on his weapon, his face grim. Jake, still distant, had already pulled out his knife, his eyes scanning the darkened streets with an intensity that was unnerving. They were no strangers to danger, but there was something about this that felt different, more menacing. The footsteps grew louder, and as the group stayed hidden, the shadowy figures finally emerged from around the corner. It wasn't a group of undead. They were survivors. But these weren't the desperate, ragged souls they had encountered before. These people moved with the confidence of those who had nothing to lose. At the front of the group was a woman, tall and commanding, dressed in tactical gear with a rifle slung over her shoulder. Behind her were several others, their eyes scanning the street with the cold calculation of hunters. "Who are they?" Mark murmured, his grip tightening on his rifle. "They look organized," Sarah replied quietly. "Not like any of the groups we've seen." The woman in the front stopped and turned her head, as if sensing the group's presence. Her eyes locked onto Sarah's for a brief, unsettling moment, and a shiver ran down Sarah's spine. There was something calculating in the woman's gaze, like she knew exactly who they were, and perhaps, even what they were capable of. Without warning, the woman raised her hand, signaling to the rest of her group. The survivors moved in unison, taking up positions around the building as if they had done this countless times before. "We need to move. Now," Mark whispered urgently, his voice tight with tension. But it was too late. A harsh voice cut through the silence. "We know you're there," the woman called out, her tone cold and commanding. "Come out, and no one gets hurt." Sarah exchanged a look with Mark. The situation had escalated faster than they'd hoped. The group had been spotted, and they had no intention of retreating. Slowly, they stood, stepping out from the shadows with their hands raised in surrender. The woman studied them for a moment, her expression unreadable. Her eyes flicked over each member of the group, assessing them with a calm, predatory gaze. "You're not the first survivors we've found," she said, her voice laced with authority. "And you won't be the last." Sarah's mind raced. What did they want? Were these people like the hostile group from before, or were they different? The woman's confidence spoke of power, but Sarah wasn't sure if that power was earned through kindness or brutality. "Are you the ones who've been picking off survivors?" Mark asked, his voice steady, though Sarah could see the tension in his jaw. The woman raised an eyebrow, as if surprised by the question. "You think we're the ones causing trouble?" "We don't waste time on weaklings," she said, her lips curling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We only take what's necessary." Her words sent a chill through Sarah. These people weren't just scavengers, they were hunters, taking whatever they deemed worthy. The brutal truth of their world was that people like them were often just as dangerous as the undead they fought to survive against. "We're looking for a place to rest," Sarah said, keeping her tone neutral. "We're not looking for a fight." The woman regarded her with calculating eyes. "Rest," she repeated, as if the word tasted foreign on her tongue. "You're welcome to join us. If you can prove you're useful." "Prove ourselves?" Mark's voice grew sharper. "We've been fighting for our lives every day. What makes you think we need to prove anything?" The woman's smile widened, though there was nothing warm about it. "Because in this world, you're either useful or you're dead. Simple as that." Sarah's heart raced as the tension thickened. This wasn't a conversation, it was a test. And they were already on the verge of failing. "We're not looking for anyone's charity," Jake suddenly said, his voice low and filled with a quiet, simmering rage. His eyes were fixed on the woman, his fists clenched by his sides. "We're survivors. We don't need your help." The woman's gaze flicked to Jake, sizing him up. A beat of silence passed before she spoke again, her voice colder than before. "Then prove it," she said, stepping closer to him. "Prove that you can survive without us." In a flash, she drew her rifle and aimed it directly at Jake. The sudden movement caught everyone off guard, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. Mark instinctively raised his weapon, but Sarah's voice stopped him. "Wait," she shouted. Her heart pounded in her chest. "We don't need this. We don't need to fight. The woman lowered her rifle slightly, her eyes never leaving Jake's face. It's not a fight if you're already dead inside. Prove you can hold your own, and we'll see if you're worth keeping around. Jake's eyes flicked to Sarah, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a flicker of the person he had once been, a person who hadn't been swallowed by the darkness. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped forward. We don't want to join your group, she said, her voice steady, but firm. But we'll do whatever it takes to survive. We'll prove it on our own terms. For a long moment, the woman studied her, her eyes narrowing slightly. Then, with a slow, deliberate nod, she lowered her rifle completely. Fine, she said, her voice hard as stone. You'll survive. For now. As the group turned to leave, Sarah's heart still hammered in her chest. They had narrowly avoided a deadly confrontation. But she knew this was far from over. The real question was whether they could survive in a world that no longer believed in kindness, only strength. They would need more than just weapons and supplies. They would need each other. Because in this world, the dead weren't the only ones to fear. The living were just as dangerous.